Hello, my name is Adam Malinauskas. I'm a social studies teacher at Mount Blue High School and a parishioner of St. Rose and St. Joseph's. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, Father Paul and I had discussed ways in which we as a parish could celebrate Maine's bicentennial by looking at the history of the Catholic Church in our state. Given that many parish activities have been suspended due to the pandemic, I would like to begin what I hope is a series of videos highlighting the people, events, and places that have contributed to the 200 plus years of the Catholic experience in this particular part of the country. Today's video is on James Augustine Healy, the second bishop of the Diocese of Portland and the first black Catholic bishop in the United States. For a quarter of a century, from 1875 to 1900, James Augustine Healy reigned as bishop of a state with a relatively small Catholic population, and oversaw one of the greatest periods of growth in the diocese. However, before speaking about Healy's life specifically, it may be worthwhile to talk about the world that he lived in, that is, the United States in the late 19th century. Obviously, this was a period marked by enormous upheaval caused by the American Civil War and the Reconstruction period. During this time, two major groups in American life had helped contribute immensely to the nation's destiny, while at the same time being sidelined, silenced, and often feared by the white, mainly Anglo-Protestant majority. These groups were the Irish immigrants and the African Americans. The Irish, who had poured into the country since the middle of the 19th century, had contributed to the industry of northern cities and made Roman Catholicism a permanent fixture in American urban life. They had also fought and died in droves during the American Civil War. In fact, it is estimated that by the close of the war, 1 in every 4 soldiers in the northern military was an immigrant, many of whom were Irish. Irish labor also helped connect the East with the opportunity of the West by contributing to the Transcontinental Railroad, along with immigrants from China. African Americans played an even larger role in the nation's destiny. Free blacks in the North had helped bolster the abolitionist movement, and as the war continued, the Union cause was more and more dedicated to the destruction of slavery. After the war, those 3 million freed in the South escaped to new opportunities in North and West, while others were briefly elected to state legislatures in the South, thanks to newly acquired votes of black men. These were states which had been rigid slave societies less than a decade before. But despite their roles in shaping what the nation was becoming, both the Irish and black Americans faced immense prejudice. Racism was prevalent in both the South and the North, and a constant obstacle to recently emancipated African Americans. Vigilante groups like the KKK sprung up in the name of the Old South and terrorized black families, while in the North, the anti-Catholic Know-Nothings had violently opposed the Irish and other immigrants for the apparent threat they posed to American culture and democracy. In many ways, the Irish in the North and the African Americans in the South represented the undesirables. The reason this background is important is that James Augustine Healy was born in 1830 as an heir to both of these experiences, and it makes the story of his life that much more remarkable. His father, Michael Morris Healy, was an Irishman who settled a plantation in Georgia after fighting for the British in the War of 1812. And his mother was a mixed-race slave woman by the name of Mary Eliza Clark. Most sources describe the relationship between James's parents as a common law marriage, as the laws of the state of Georgia strictly forbade marriage between people of different races. However, the two had a monogamous relationship, and Michael Morris Healy always treated his wife and his children as, well, his family. However, Georgia law also prevented one from freeing their slaves, except by a special act of the state legislature, which would have been highly unlikely. And though the Catholic Church to which Michael Healy nominally belonged was unopposed to interracial marriages, it's unclear if they were ever married sacramentally. It seems James' father was not a particularly pious man. His children would not be baptized until much later in their life. Under Georgia law, James and his 10 siblings were all born slaves. Moreover, the same laws that prevented Michael Morris from freeing his wife prevented him from freeing his children. Michael, however, wanted them educated and sent his sons north to attend, at first, Quaker schools. This changed when he had a chance encounter with Bishop Fitzpatrick of Boston, and the prelate convinced him to send James and his brothers to the newly minted Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was there that James would finally be baptized into the Catholic Church, and where he decided to become a priest. After some time in Massachusetts, James attended a seminary in French Canada and later in France, where he was ordained a priest in Notre Dame Cathedral in 1854. Returning home from Europe, James began his priestly mission in Boston as a pastor and later as an assistant to Bishop Fitzpatrick, who had become his lifetime mentor. There, he became acquainted with the poor, working-class Irish community of Boston and was their faithful priest throughout the American Civil War. It was also in Boston that Healy made a name for himself as an advocate for the downtrodden, voicing opposition to Massachusetts' anti-Catholic laws and speaking out against the use of child labor. When he was appointed bishop of the Diocese of Portland by the Pope in 1875, few doubted James' ability as a pastor and advocate for the poor. Even outside of Catholic circles, James Augustine was often praised, and while Bishop of Maine, he was considered one of the best preachers in New England. However, his appointment did face some opposition. One Maine priest objected to Healy interfering with his pastoral duties and encroaching on his priestly dominion even before James had become a bishop. This encroachment was due to the fact that Healy had decided to give catechism lessons to some children on vacation in Maine before his appointment. However, the pastor's reference to Healy's indelicate blood, that is, his status as being from black descent, seems to suggest that the complaint was racially motivated. When this particular priest offered his resignation from the diocese after Healy's appointment, Bishop Healy promptly refused it. It seems very few others in the diocese objected to the new bishop on the account of his race, though it was widely known that he was of African ancestry. His light complexion and infrequent personal identification with blacks did not make this identity very apparent. The diocese itself was in many ways divided into ethnic subcultures who faced prejudice from the wider Maine community, as well as contributing to ethnic infighting in the church. Bishop Healy, however, seemed to navigate these subcultures with relative ease, and became mostly beloved by all of them. To the Irish, he was one of their own, and continued to rub shoulders with the Irish workers of Portland, as he had in Boston. To the French, he was a fluent French speaker, and the most francophone, friendly bishop that the diocese had had. In fact, he actually encouraged all priests in the diocese to become bilingual, in an attempt to help the French-Canadian immigrants feel more welcomed in the diocese. To the Wabanaki, the Maine native peoples who in many ways represented the oldest group of Catholics in the state, he became a passionate advocate for native rights and welfare. He encouraged religious orders in the state to extend their educational ministries to the native communities, sat on the Commission on Negro and Indian Missions, and spoke out in favor of the rights and nationhood of Maine native peoples to Congress. He even became a consultant on the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs because of his advocacy. As bishop, Healy also continued to fight for the well-being of children, particularly Civil War orphans, and in fact he purchased an island in Portland as a vacation site for the children of Maine. Bishop Healy is also well remembered for shepherding the Church of Maine through a time of immense growth. During his reign, the population of Catholics in the region doubled, eventually leading to the splitting of the diocese, which had up to this point included New Hampshire, into the Diocese of Portland and the Diocese of Manchester. He also oversaw mass brick-and-mortar development, which led to the construction of many new churches, both Anglophone and Francophone. This included bringing the church's presence into more rural areas of the state, including the construction of St. Joseph's in Farmington in 1885 and of St. Rose of Lima in Jay in 1894. While bishop, the diocese saw an influx of many women's and men's religious orders, as well as the first chapter of the Knights of Columbus in the state in Portland in 1894. Much can be said about Bishop Healy's legacy. He was by all marks an exceptional and influential leader of the church in New England, and his life story lends itself to an understanding of American history that is perhaps more complex than the narratives we're used to hearing. In the history of black Catholics, he is a complex figure. Strangely enough, he is often remembered as the first black bishop of the United States, but very rarely the first black priest. That distinction is usually given to Father Augustus Tolton, another priest born into slavery, who is currently in process for canonization. This distinction is mainly due to the fact that James Healy and his siblings could often pass for white because of their light complexion. Moreover, the bishop did very little to align himself with the causes of African Americans in general, and black Catholics in particular. In fact, though the black Catholic lay movement was gaining ground in the years after the Civil War, Bishop Healy denied invitations to attend any of their conferences. Some historians attribute this fact to the commitment of his duties as a bishop of a demanding and rapidly growing episcopate, while others posit that Healy, though considered black by many, mainly thought of himself as an Irish American, and was partially ashamed of his origins in Georgia slavery. Whatever the case, James Augustine Healy remains a remarkable figure, and one that should be close to our hearts as Catholics and as Mainers. By representing an amalgam of both the black and Irish experiences in America, he presents a fascinating story to all who are interested in our nation's history. I hope you learned something from this video today about the Catholic experience in Maine, in celebration of the state's bicentennial. Be well, and God bless.